Prior to the campaign against the Western powers, which we would have been glad to avoid, the experience of fighting in Poland was studied. This experience showed, and for me it was not unexpected, that light infantry divisions are incomplete formations. It was decided to reform them into tank divisions numbered 6 to 9. The motorized divisions proved to be too cumbersome in their composition, and one infantry regiment each was withdrawn from them. The rearmament of tank regiments with TII and TIV type tanks, which was especially important and necessary, progressed extremely slowly because of the weak production capacity of industry and as a result of the canning of new types of tanks by the General Command of the Ground Forces. Several armoured divisions and the Greater Germany Infantry Regiment were placed under my command for combat training. I was mainly occupied with thoughts about the plan and possible course of operations in the West. The General Command of the Land Forces, pushed by Hitler, intended to use the old plan again, the so-called Schlieffen Plan of 1914. It was quicker and simpler, but contained nothing new. So very soon thought began to work in a different direction. One day in November 1939, Manstein asked me to come to see him. He gave me his views on an offensive by a large armoured force through Luxembourg and southern Belgium to the Maginot Line at Sedan, with the aim of breaking through this fortified section and then the entire French front. Manstein asked me to consider his proposal from the point of view of a specialist in armoured forces. After a detailed study of maps and on the basis of personal acquaintance with the conditions of the terrain during the First World War, I was able to assure Manstein that his planned operation is feasible. The only condition I could put was the use in this offensive of a sufficient number of tank and motorized divisions, and preferably all of them. After that, Manstein drafted a report note. Approved and signed by Colonel General von Rundstedt on December 4, 1939, the report note was sent to the General Command of Land Forces, but it was not approved there. The Army High Command initially wanted to use only 1 or 2 panzer divisions for the Arlon offensive. An exchange of views on this issue began. I considered such forces too weak, and therefore the operation aimless. Fragmentation of the already weak armoured forces would be the biggest mistake that can be made at all. Facing the possibility of making such a mistake just stood the main command of ground forces. Manstein insistently sought his own, which brought on himself the disfavour of the General Command of the Land Forces to such an extent that he was appointed commander of the Army Corps. He asked to give him at least a tank corps, but his request was not granted. So Manstein, our best operational mind, with a corps in the third echelon and participated in the campaign, the brilliant realization of which was largely due to the initiative he showed. He was succeeded under Colonel General von Rundstedt by the calmer General von Zodenstern. Meanwhile, an incident that occurred in the Air Force forced the command to abandon the plan Schlieffen. Air Force liaison officer on the night of January 10, 1940, with important documents flew the plane across the Belgian border, which was forbidden. The airplane made an emergency landing on Belgian territory. According to the documents which were with the officer, it was possible to guess about the planned offensive according to the Schlieffen plan. Whether he managed to destroy the documents was unknown. In any case, it should be considered that the offensive may have become known to the Belgians and apparently also the French and British. In addition, Manstein, who appeared to Hitler in connection with the appointment to the post of Corps Commander, took the opportunity to give him his opinion on future operations. Thereafter, Manstein's operational plan became the subject of scrutiny. On February 7, 1940, during a staff war game in Koblenz, I got a clear picture of it. At this game, I proposed on the 5th day of the campaign to launch an offensive with large tank and motorized forces to break through the defences on the Maas River at Sedan and further develop the offensive in the direction of Amiens. Chief of the General Staff of the Land Forces Galder, who was present at the manoeuvres, called this proposal meaningless. It seemed to him that it is enough to reach the Maas armoured troops, to create on it pre-bridge fortifications, to wait for the approach of field armies and then launch a joint offensive, not earlier than on the 9th or 10th day of the campaign. I fervently objected and emphasised that it is a question of concentrated and sudden use of all the striking power of the available in a limited number of tanks in one decisive area to expand the breakthrough, and then strengthening the strike group to go to such a depth so as not to fear for the flanks and immediately exploit the possible success, regardless of the degree of advance of army corps. My opinion of the importance of the border fortifications was supported by Major von Stiota, the fortification specialist attached to the army group, who had carefully studied the matter. Mr. von Stiota based himself mainly on the available aerial photography material, and his arguments were therefore irrefutable. On February 14th, in Mayenne, at the headquarters of the 12th Army of Colonel General List for the second time in the presence of Halder, a war game was held, at which the battle for the crossing of the Meuse was played out. The main question put before me was whether the armoured divisions should independently force the river or wait for the approach of infantry, whether in the latter case they should take part in the offensive immediately after forcing the river, given the difficult terrain in the Ardennes north of the Meuse. The exchange of views proceeded so discouragingly that General von Wietersheim, commander of the 14th Motorized Army Corps, which was to follow my corps, and I concluded by saying that under such conditions we could not believe in carrying out this operation. We stated that this use of tanks was wrong, and that if it were to be carried out as ordered, a crisis of confidence might result. The matter became even more complicated when it became clear that Colonel General von Rundstedt also does not have a clear idea of the combat capabilities of tanks and favoured a cautious solution to this issue. Now that's where Manstein was needed. Especially much had to break the head over the issues of leadership of a large number of armoured formations. Finally, after much debate settled on the candidacy of General von Kleist, who had not previously been a supporter of tank troops. After it became clear that my tank corps in any case will have to strike at the enemy through the Ardennes, I diligently engaged in combat training of generals and staff officers to fulfill the upcoming task. In my subordination went to the 1st, 2nd and 10th Panzer Divisions, Infantry Regiment Greater Germany, a number of corps units and units, among which was also one division of mortars. All the units, with the exception of the Great Germany Regiment, were familiar to me. Some I had dealt with before the war, others during the war years, so I certainly believed in their fighting ability. Now I had an opportunity to prepare these men for a heavy task, in the success of which no one actually believed, except Hitler, Manstein, and me. The moral struggle for the realization of this idea was very exhausting. Therefore I needed a little rest, which was granted to me in the second half of March. However, even before that, on March 15th in the Imperial Chancellery held a conversation between the commander of Army Group A with Hitler. The conversation was attended by General von Kleist and myself. Each of those present reported their thoughts on the method of accomplishing the task at hand. I was the last to report. My plan was as follows. On the day scheduled by the order to cross the Luxembourgian border and then move through southern Belgium to Sedan, to force the Maas River at Sedan, capturing on the left bank of the Pre-Bridge fortification to ensure the crossing of the infantry corps following me. Briefly, I explained that my corps will advance through Luxembourg and southern Belgium in 3 columns, that I expect to reach the Belgian border positions on the first day, and if possible to break through them, on the second day to continue the advance through Neuchâteau, on the third, to cross the Semois River at Bouillon, on the fourth, to reach the river. Maas on the 5th day, to force the river, and by the evening of the same day, to capture the Pre-Bridge fortification. Hitler asked, "And what do you want to do next?" He was the first to put this decisive question at all. I replied, "If there is no order to suspend the advance, I will the next day to continue the offensive in a westerly direction. The High Command must decide whether this blow should be directed at Amiens or Paris. The most effective, in my opinion, would be the direction through Amiens to the English Channel." Hitler nodded his head but said nothing. Only General Busch, who commanded the 16th Army operating on my left, exclaimed, "No, I do not believe that you will be able to force it." Hitler awaited my answer with obvious tension. My answer was, "You do not need to do so." To this, Hitler also said nothing. Subsequently, I never received an order that provided for more than the creation of a pre-bridge fortification on the Maas River. I independently drafted all the decisions up to the approach to the Atlantic coast at Abbeville. The High Command had an inhibiting influence mainly on my operations. After a short vacation, I again began preparations for this major operation. The long winter was replaced by a mild, charming spring. Repeated drill alarms threatened to turn into combat alarms. Before describing the events, I think it would be appropriate to explain why I was so confidently preparing for the heavy offensive ahead. For this purpose, I shall have to go back a little. World War I, after a brief period of manoeuvring on the Western Front, froze in positional battles. No concentration of military means, which had reached enormous proportions, was able to move the fronts until, in November 1916, tanks appeared on the enemy's side and carried, thanks to their armour, tracks and armament, consisting of guns and machine guns, previously unprotected soldiers through barrage and wire fences, through ditches and craters alive and combat-ready to the front of the German defences. The offensive was again restored to its rights. This phenomenon was peculiar and deserved serious attention. Unfortunately, the Germans underestimated tanks during that war. It no longer matters whether this is due to the lack of technical awareness of government officials or to the weakness of the German war industry. How great is the importance of tanks showed the Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited Germany, under penalty of punishment, to have and produce armoured cars, tanks and other similar machines that could serve military purposes. Consequently, in our enemies the tank was considered a military weapon of such decisive importance that we were forbidden to have it. Hence, I concluded that it was necessary to scrutinize the history of this combat weapon of decisive importance and trace its further development. From the theoretical analysis made by a man unconstrained by any tradition, a conclusion was reached about the design and use of tanks and the organization and use of armored formations, a conclusion that went beyond the theories prevailing abroad. In persistent arguments lasting for years, I succeeded in putting my convictions into practice before other armies had approached similar problems. The advantage in projected organization and in the combat use of tanks was the first factor on which my belief in success was based. Even in 1940, I was almost alone in the German army in believing this. A comprehensive study of the First World War allowed me to make an in-depth analysis of the psychology of the belligerents. I knew the German army well from my own observations. About the state of mind of our Western opponents, I had also created a certain opinion, which was confirmed in 1940. In military thought, in spite of the new weapon, tanks, to which the opponents should be mainly grateful for their victory in 1918, position warfare prevailed. France had the strongest land army and the largest armoured forces in Western Europe. Anglo-French armed forces in the West in May 1940 had at their disposal about 4,800 tanks. In the German armed forces on the list was listed as 2,800 tanks, including armoured cars, and in fact by the beginning of the offensive they numbered about 2,200. Consequently, the enemy had a double superiority, which was reinforced by the fact that the French tanks surpassed the German armour protection and calibre of guns, however inferior to them in the perfection of control devices and speed. Despite the presence of this strongest mobile combat weapons, France created the Maginot Line, the strongest fortified frontier in the world. So why was the money invested in fortifications not used to modernize and strengthen the mobile assets? The efforts of de Gaulle and Daladier in this direction were ignored. Hence the conclusion that the High Command of the French army did not recognize or did not want to recognize the importance of tanks in maneuver warfare. In any case, all known to me, maneuvers and major military exercises testified to the intention of the French command to organize the management of its troops in such a way that reliably justified decisions fully ensure maneuvering and carrying out systematic offensive and defensive measures, strive to accurately determine the position and grouping of enemy forces before taking a decision, and when it was already taken, then acted in absolute compliance with it and acted, I would say, exactly in accordance with the schema of the French army. This desire to act strictly according to the plan, leaving nothing to chance, also led to the inclusion of tanks in the land forces, in a form that would not violate the scheme, their distribution to infantry divisions, and only a small proportion of tanks were intended for operational use. The German command could safely assume that the defence of France, taking into account the use of fortifications planned cautiously and schematically on the doctrine based on the conclusions from the First World War, i.e., the experience of positional warfare, a high estimate of fire and underestimation of manoeuvre, the familiar principles of French strategy and tactics of 1940, the opposite of my method of fighting, were the second factor justifying my belief in victory. By the spring of 1940, the German side had a clear picture of the grouping of forces and fortifications of the enemy. We knew that on the Maginot Line between Montmedy and Sedan, very strong fortifications alternate with weak ones. The fortifications running from Sedan to the Channel we called the continuation of the Maginot Line. We also knew the location, and in the main the strength of the Belgian and Dutch fortifications erected against Germany. The garrison of the Maginot Line was insignificant. The main forces of the French Land Army, including armoured divisions and the British Expeditionary Force, were concentrated in French Flanders between the Maas River and the English Channel, with a front to the northeast. In contrast, Belgian and Dutch troops were deployed to defend their countries against attack from the east. From this distribution of forces, it was possible to infer the enemy's calculation that the Germans would act a second time on the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. Therefore, the main forces of the Allied armies were apparently intended to be used against the encompassing manoeuvre of the Germans through Holland and Belgium. To ensure the advance of Allied troops in Belgium, the French did not have sufficient reserves in the area of Charleville or Verdun. It seemed that the French High Command considered it impossible to any other option for the offensive, except for the old plan Schlieffen. This known to us grouping of enemy forces and the possibility of predetermining his behaviour in the initial period of the offensive German troops were the third factor that determined my belief in victory. To this could still be added some, though less reliable, but worthy of mentioning considerations on the question of the general assessment of our opponents. We knew the French from the First World War and respected them as brave and steadfast soldiers who vigorously defended their country. We had no doubt that they had retained these qualities. As for the French High Command, we were surprised to see that they did not take advantage of the favourable occasion for an offensive in the fall of 1939, when the bulk of the German land forces, especially armoured forces, were tied up in Poland. The reasons for this restraint could not be determined at the time. One could only speculate. At any rate, the caution of the High Command was surprising, and suggested that in the top they hoped to avoid a serious military campaign. The passive, to some extent, behaviour of the French during the winter of 1939–40 led to the conclusion that France had little desire to fight. From all this it followed that a purposeful sudden strike by large tank forces through Sedan to Amiens, with access to the Atlantic coast, will meet only a strongly stretched flank of the enemy in readiness to move into Belgium. To repel such a blow, the enemy has little reserves. Such a blow promised great hopes of success, which if immediately used could lead to the encirclement of all the main forces of the enemy advancing into Belgium. It was now a question of convincing my superiors, and, to the same extent, my subordinates of the correctness of my thoughts, and thus of obtaining the freedom of action authorized from above and the correct understanding from below. If the resolution of the first question was very imperfect, the latter was much better. In the event of an offensive in force, remained the order that the 19th Army Corps, advancing through the northern part of Luxembourg and the southern part of Belgium, reaching the river Maas at Sedan, to form a pre-bridge fortification on it, which will enable the infantry divisions advancing behind it to force the river. In case of sudden success, no instructions were given. There were developed issues of interaction with aviation. I had to coordinate my actions with the short-range aviation connection of the extremely brave General von Stutterheim and with the aviation corps of General Loerser. In order to organize effective interaction, I invited pilots to the exercises I organized and myself took part in the war games conducted by Loerser. The subject of discussion at these war games was the crossing of the Meuse. After careful analysis, we came to an agreed decision to use aviation during the entire period of forcing the river, i.e. to make not one accompanied strike by bombers, both conventional and dive bombers, but from the very beginning of the crossing by constant attacks and disturbing raids to paralyze the enemy's artillery batteries in open firing positions, forcing the gun crews to constantly take cover from actual and false raids. On the map were mapped the tasks of the troops by time and boundaries. Shortly before the offensive began, at Goering's request, a battalion of the infantry regiment, Greater Germany, was loaded onto Storch-type transport planes for the purpose of landing on the morning of the first day of the offensive directly behind the Belgian front at Vitry, west of Martelange. The battalion's actions were intended to cause the enemy to be uncertain about the ability to defend their border fortifications. In order to quickly advance through Luxembourg and the southern part of Belgium, the 3 armoured divisions of the Corps entered the battle simultaneously in the first echelon, having close contact with each other on the inner flanks. The 1st Armoured Division was to advance in the centre, followed by Corps artillery, Corps headquarters, and most of the anti-aircraft artillery. In the initial period of the offensive, these forces struck the main blow. The 2nd Armoured Division was advancing on the right and the 10th Armoured Division with the Greater Germany Infantry Regiment on the left. The 1st Armoured Division was commanded by General Kirchner, the 2nd by General Feil, and the 10th by General Schall. All 3 were well known to me. I believed in their abilities and in their goodwill. They knew my combat principles. They knew that tank formations going on the road have a travel ticket to the final stop. In our campaign, the final goal was the English Channel. This sounded clear and convincing to every soldier, even if he did not receive orders for a long time after the beginning of the offensive. Reaching the Channel. On May 9, 1940, in the afternoon, at 13h30 sounded the battle alarm. At 4 p.m. I left Koblenz and arrived by evening at the Corps command post, at Sonnengoff near Bitburg. The troops were standing, as ordered, in readiness along the border between the Wanden and Echternach. On May 10th at 5:35 I crossed with the 1st Armoured Division, concentrated in the Wallendorf area, the Luxembourg border at Martelange. The vanguard of the 1st Armoured Division broke through the border fortifications, established communication with the Airborne Landing Regiment Great Germany, but advanced into Belgium only to a small depth, as it was prevented by severe destruction on the roads. The destroyed sections of roads in the mountainous terrain could not be bypassed. During the night, the roads were restored. The 2nd Armoured Division fought for Strenzschan. The 10th Armoured Division advanced through Abella-Neuve towards the French troops, 2nd Cavalry Division and 3rd Colonial Infantry Division. Corps headquarters moved to Rambruch, east of Martelange. On 11th of May in the afternoon, mined areas along the Belgian border were overcome. By mid-afternoon, the 1st Armoured Division began its offensive. With tanks in the first echelon, the division was advancing on fortified positions erected on both sides of the Neuchâtel and defended by Ardennes gamekeepers from the Belgian border troops and French cavalry. After short fighting with few losses, the enemy positions were broken through and Neuchâtel was taken. The 1st Armoured Division immediately organised a pursuit, captured Bertry and already at dusk reached Bouillon, where the French, however, managed to hold out another night. Both other divisions advanced without delay, with little fighting, the 2nd Armoured Division taking Libramont. The 10th Armoured Division suffered minor losses at Abla-Neuve. On May 10th, Lieutenant Colonel Ellerman, commander of the 69th Infantry Regiment, was killed at Sainte-Marie. On the night of May 11th, The commander of the tank group Kleist ordered to immediately turn the 10th Panzer Division to Longwy to ensure the left flank of the group, as there was a report that the French cavalry advancing from there. I asked to refrain from this, given that the diversion of 1/3 of my forces for the sake of ensuring the flank from a possible attack of enemy cavalry could disrupt the forcing of the Maas River, and thus the success of the entire operation. To avoid these difficulties caused by an incomprehensibly fear of the cavalry, I sent the 10th Panzer Division on a parallel road running north of the previously established for it the way of movement through Rel to the section of the River Semois, Kionion-Mortian with the task to continue the offensive. The threat of stopping the offensive and changing its direction was at first overcome. The command of the group abandoned its intention. The French cavalry never appeared. The Great Germania Infantry Regiment was withdrawn from the battle in the evening and placed at the disposal of the Corps. Corps headquarters was stationed at Neuchâtel during the night. On Trinity Day, May 12th at 5 o'clock, I left with the first echelon of my headquarters via Bertry, Fay-le-Venay, Bellevaux for Bouillon, which, at 7 o'clock, 45 Manicheers was attacked and quickly captured by Lieutenant Colonel Bulk's 1st Infantry Regiment. The bridge over the Semois River had been blown up by the French, but the tanks were able to ford the river at various points. The engineers of the division immediately began to build a new bridge. Convinced of the expediency of the measures taken, I crossed the river and followed the tanks in the direction of Sedan, but had to return to Bouillon again, as the roads were mined. In the southern part of the city, I had to endure the first enemy air raid on the bridge gunning area of the 1st Armoured Division. The bridge fortunately remained undamaged, only a few houses caught fire. Then I drove through the forest to the 10th Armoured Division, which overcame the enemy defences in the area of Cugnon and Herbemont. On the highway along which the division was advancing, I found myself witnessing the battle of a reconnaissance battalion for the border fortifications. Directly behind the scouts came the infantry led by the brave brigade commander Colonel Fischer, followed by the infantry, followed by the division commander General Charles. The rapid advance of the division, whose officers were in battle order, made a remarkable impression. The fortifications in the woods were captured in a short time. The advance continued through La Chapelle to Bazay and Ballan. I was able to return in peace to Bouillon to the Corps command post. Colonel Nering, Chief of Staff, had in the meantime settled himself at the Panorama Hotel, which afforded a splendid view of the beautiful valley of the Semois River. My place was tastefully, carefully arranged in a niche with the hunter's trophies in the general workroom. We set to work. But suddenly several explosions were heard one after the other. Airplanes again. But this was not the end of the matter. A convoy with close combat equipment, explosives, mines and hand grenades caught fire. Explosions followed one after another. The giant head of a wild boar hanging above me flew off the wall and almost killed me. Other trophies also flew down. The glass in the window overlooking the beautiful valley where I was sitting shattered and shards flew right over my head. It became very uncomfortable to work here, and we decided to move to another place. A small hotel on a hill north of Bouillon, where the headquarters of the 1st Tank Regiment was located, was chosen. While inspecting the hotel, General von Stutterheim, commander of the short-range aviation connection, who was present there, drew my attention to the fact that the house was located in the open. Indeed, while we were talking to him, a squadron of Belgian airplanes appeared and dropped bombs on the location of the tanks. The losses were minimal, but we had to accept Stutterheim's warnings, and we decided to go even further north to the next settlements, Bellevaux and Noirfontaine. But even before the beginning of this second move, a Storch airplane came to pick me up, which was to take me to the headquarters of General Kleist's group to receive the order. At headquarters I received orders to begin the offensive across the Maas River the next day, May 13th at 4 p.m. My 1st and 10th Panzer Divisions could be concentrated by this time at the initial positions, but the 2nd Panzer Division, which met with difficulties on the river Semois, of course, could not concentrate. I reported on this circumstance, which was of great importance, given the smallness of the entire advancing group. General von Kleist insisted on his order, and I had to admit that it would be more appropriate to start the offensive directly from the march, without waiting for a full deployment. The subsequent order was even more unpleasant. General von Kleist and Air Force General Sperle, unaware of my agreement with Lürzer, decided to conduct a concentrated bombing raid before the artillery preparation. This could have derailed my entire plan of attack, as a prolonged suppression of enemy artillery was no longer provided. I strongly protested and asked to restore my original plan on which the entire offensive was based. But General von Kleist rejected my request, and I flew on the same Storch, but already with another pilot flew to his corps. My young pilot claimed that he knew the exact location of the landing place from which I had taken off, but at dusk he did not find it, and we very soon found ourselves over the Meuse and over the French positions. I experienced a rather unpleasant feeling being in an unarmed, defenceless Storch, and then immediately oriented myself and ordered the pilot to fly north. We soon found the landing pad, and all turned out safely. Upon arrival at the Corps command post, I set about drafting orders and instructions with great zeal. We were given very limited time, and so, to speed up the work, we used the orders developed during the headquarters exercise in Koblenz, took them out of the files, changed the date and time, and then sent them to the troops. These orders corresponded exactly to the actual situation. The 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions did the same, which greatly accelerated and simplified the issuance of orders. On the evening of May 12th, the 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions seized the north bank of the river, Meuse, and took the historic city and fortress of Sedan. The night was used to get to the initial position and equip the firing positions of the Corps artillery and artillery of the tank group. The 1st Armoured Division, reinforced by the Great Germania Infantry Regiment, Corps Artillery and Heavy Artillery divisions of both divisions operating on the flanks, struck the main blow. Consequently, the 2nd and 10th Armoured Divisions had only 2 light artillery divisions each on the first day of the offensive. This weakness of the flanks and artillery had to be taken into account in the fighting of both divisions on May 13. On May 13, the Corps command post moved to La Chapelle. On the morning of May 13th, I went first to the command post of the 1st Armoured Division to check on the troops in the initial position. Then, after driving through partially mined terrain, which the drivers of the vehicles of my headquarters cleared of mines, and skipping through the artillery fire of the French fortifications, I arrived at the 2nd Armoured Division at Suny. The forward units of this division had reached the French border. In the middle of the day, I was already at the Corps headquarters, which by this time had moved to La Chapelle. At 3 p.m. 30 minutes, despite the French artillery fire, I went to the advanced observation post of the 10th Armoured Division in order to observe the artillery preparations and aviation actions. On the way, I had to cross an area shelled by French artillery. At 4 p.m., the battle began with artillery preparation, quite significant for our conditions. With special tension, I awaited the air attack. The planes appeared exactly at the appointed time, and my surprise was indescribable when I saw that squadrons of dive and conventional bombers, operating under cover of fighters, attacked the enemy exactly as we had agreed with Lürzer at the headquarters game. Either General von Kleist came to his senses, or the order to change the order of attack did not arrive at the destination. Either way, but the Air Force acted on those methods, which, in my opinion, were most favourable to our offensive, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I was now to follow the infantry advance across the Meuse. The fording of the river should have been completed by now, and I headed for Saint-Manges, and from there through Flouin to the planned crossing point of the 1st Armoured Division. In the first assault boat I could find, I crossed the river. On the other bank I met the smart and brave commander of the 1st Infantry Regiment, Lieutenant Valk, who was there with his staff. I was greeted with an exclamation, "Boating on the Maas is forbidden." It was I who had once made such a remark at the preparatory staff training, when the reasoning of some young officers seemed to me too frivolous. Now they were able to correctly assess the situation. The advance of the 1st Infantry Regiment and the Great Germania Infantry Regiment on its left was proceeding like an inspector's review in a training camp. French artillery was almost completely overwhelmed by the constant exposure of dive bombers. Concrete structures on the banks of the Meuse were put out of action by the fire of anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns. Enemy machine guns were suppressed by our heavy weapons and artillery. The infantry was advancing on completely open ground, which was a wide meadow, but in spite of this, the losses were very slight. Before darkness fell, it was possible to cut deeply into a strip of enemy fortifications. The troops were ordered to continue the offensive all night, and I was confident that they would carry out this most important order. By 23 o'clock they captured Chevège and part of the forest of Marfay and broke through the leading edge of the French defences west of Vadlencourt. Overwhelmed with joy and pride, I headed for the Corps command post in the La Garenne forest. I left just in time to be hit by another enemy air raid on the road to La Chapelle. Arriving at the command post, I sat down to look over the reports from the divisions on the flanks. The 2nd Armoured Division, operating on the right flank, entered the battle only with its advanced units, reconnaissance and motorcycle battalions, supported by heavy artillery. The division could not ford the river with these forces. The 1st Panzer Division, together with the infantry brigade, was already on the left bank of the Maas, preparing to pull up artillery and tanks after the bridge. The Great Germania Infantry Regiment was also on the other side of the Maas. The 10th Armoured Division, having crossed the river, established a small pre-bridge fortification. On this day it was in a difficult position due to lack of artillery support. The division's advance was severely hampered by flanking fire from the Maginot Line south of Douzy-Carignan. The position of the 10th and 2nd Armoured Divisions improved. Corps anti-aircraft artillery took overnight firing positions in the areas of flooding bridges over the Meuse, as on May 14th to count on the support of aircraft operating in another area. It was impossible. During the night I telephoned Lursa to find out how the aviation would be used in the future, and at the same time to thank him for the exceptionally good support which had contributed greatly to our successes. I learned that Speul's order was late and could not be communicated to the squadrons, and that therefore Lursa had simply delayed it. I then reported by radio on the success of my troops Busch, who at one time in Berlin during a report to the Führer expressed doubts about whether I could force the Maas. Busch gave me compliments. In conclusion, I thanked the officers of my staff for their dedicated work. On the morning of May 14th, the valiant 1st Armoured Division reported that it had greatly expanded its breakthrough during the night and passed through Chemery. So forward to Chemery. On the banks of the Meuse are thousands of prisoners of war. At Chemery I was present when the commander of the 1st Panzer Division gave the order. Having learned about the approach of large tank forces of the French, I ordered the 1st Armoured Division with all its tank units to start an offensive towards Stonne. I myself went to the bridge across the Meuse, so that with the help of my task force located in this area, to organise the crossing of the 2nd Tank Brigade directly after the 1st and meet the French with large forces. The French were defeated. At Bühlsen they lost 20 tanks, at Chemery 50. The infantry regiment Greater Germany took possession of Bühlsen and began to advance on Villers-Mezoncelles. Unfortunately, shortly after my departure, our dive bombers attacked their infantry concentrations at Chemery, inflicting considerable casualties. Meanwhile, the 2nd Armoured Division had forced the Maas at Donchéry and was preparing to attack the heights along the south bank of the river. I went there to familiarise myself with the progress of the battle. Having met the responsible commanders, Colonels von Wurst and von Prietwitz, in the combat orders of the units and talked with them, I returned to the Maas again. There the enemy planes began an intensive bombardment, but extremely bravely attacking French and British troops still failed to reach the bridge. Their losses were great. The anti-aircraft artillery was celebrating its day. It fired perfectly. By evening it had on its account about 150 downed aircraft. Subsequently, the regimental commander, Colonel von Hippel, was awarded the Order of the Knight's Cross. Meanwhile, the 2nd Tank Brigade continuous stream crossed the river, in the middle of the day. To our mutual joy, we were visited by the commander of the army group, Colonel General von Rundstedt, to familiarise himself with the situation. I met him with his report in the middle of the bridge just in time for a new air raid. He asked dryly, "Is it always like this here?" I could purely attest to that. He then thanked the brave troops very warmly. "Forward again, to the 1st Armoured Division." I met the division commander, accompanied by his chief of staff, Major Wenck, and asked whether the entire division could be turned westward or whether some of the forces should be left to cover the flank, deploying them with a front to the southeast of the Desardennes Canal. Wenck said, thinking aloud, "It's worth getting dirty." I have often used that expression myself. The matter was settled. The 1st and 2nd Armoured Divisions immediately received orders to turn with all forces to the right, force the Desardennes Canal, and advance westward with the task of completing the breakthrough of the French front. To coordinate the actions of both divisions, I went through Donchéry to the headquarters of the 2nd Armoured Division, which was located in the castle of Rocagne. From here I had a good view of the terrain over which the 2nd Armoured Division was advancing on May 13th and 14. I was surprised that the French long-range artillery from the Maginot Line so weakly and ineffectively shelled the concentration of our troops in the initial positions. Subsequently, when visiting the Maginot Line, the success of our offensive seemed to me just a miracle. In the afternoon I again returned to the command post to think about the organisation of interaction between the divisions on May 15th. Directly behind my corps followed the 41st Army Corps Rheingarde, and beginning on May 12th he was introduced into the battle on the right flank of the 19th Army Corps in the direction of Mézières-Charleville. On May 13th it had crossed the Meuse and was now advancing westward, General von Wittesheim's 14th Army Corps coming close to my corps and was soon to appear on the Meuse. The 1st Armoured Division had forced the Desardennes Canal and, breaking stubborn enemy resistance, reached Sengly and Wandres. Tank units of the 10th Armoured Division passed the line of Mazonquel, Raucourt et Floba and reached the heights south of Bulson, Telon with their main forces, capturing from the enemy more than 40 guns. The 19th Army Corps was tasked to reach the dominant heights in the Stonne area, deprive the enemy of the opportunity to fire on the bridges across the Meuse, and provide the advancing units in the 2nd Echelon unimpeded crossing. Infantry Regiment Greater Germany and the 10th Panzer Division began the attack on these heights on May 14th. The enemy offered stubborn resistance. The Stonne locality repeatedly changed hands. On May 15th, the fighting ended. On May 15th, at 4 a.m., the commander of the 14th Army Corps, General von Wittesheim, came to my command post to arrange for a change of my corps at the pre-bridge fortification south of Sedan. After a brief discussion of the situation, we proceeded to the command post of the 10th Armoured Division, located near Bulson. The division commander, General Schall, was in the forward units, Chief of Staff, an excellent commander. Lieutenant Colonel Baron von Liebenstein reported the situation and patiently answered many tricky questions of our successor. In order for the shift to take place under normal conditions, we decided that the 10th Armoured Division and the Infantry Regiment Great Germany, until the full shift will be in the 14th Army Corps. I had to confine myself to giving orders to the 1st and 2nd Armoured Divisions. The 10th Armoured Division, with its attached infantry regiment, Greater Germany, was tasked to provide the southern flank of the 19th Corps on the line, the Desardennes Canal, heights near Stonne, the bend of the Maas River south of Vilmontry. Already on May 15th, it was reinforced by advanced units of the 29th Motorized Division. From the command post of the 10th Armoured Division, I went to Stonne to the infantry regiment, Great Germany. There the French launched an attack, and some nervousness was felt in the mood, but the positions were eventually held. I then proceeded to the new corps command post in the woods near Sapon-Fescher, already on the south bank of the Meuse. The night passed, contrary to my expectations. Very restless, but this was not due to the actions of the enemy, but to the difficulties created by our command. Commander of the tank group, Kleist ordered to suspend the offensive and limited to the defence of the pre-bridge fortification. I did not want and could not agree with this order, for it meant the loss of the moment of surprise and a complete abandonment of the initial success already achieved. Therefore, I contacted first the Chief of Staff of the tank group, Colonel Zeitzler, and when I failed to resolve the issue with him, then directly with General von Kleist, I insisted that the order to halt the offensive be rescinded. After very lively and repeatedly interrupted negotiations, General von Kleist finally authorized the continuation of the offensive for another 24 hours in order to expand the pre-bridge fortification to accommodate the infantry corps. I touched on Genscher's mission in the conversation, and with this I was reminded of the Miracle on the Marne of 1914. This thought probably caused an unpleasant feeling among the group commanders. Satisfied that I had won the right to maneuver freely, I headed out in the early morning of May 16th to the headquarters of the 1st Armoured Division. I drove through Vendressé to Aumont. The situation at the front was not yet quite clear. It was only known that during the night there was heavy fighting around Bouvelmont. So, to Bouvelmont, on the street of the burning village, I met the regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel Balk, who reported on the events of the night. The troops had had no real rest since May 9th, and therefore felt very tired. Ammunition was running low. Soldiers in the front lines slept in the trenches. Balk himself, wearing a sports waterproof jacket and with a knotted stick in his hand, told me that it was possible to capture the village at night only because he replied to his officer's proposal to stop the offensive. Then I alone will capture the village, and moved forward. And moved forward. His men followed him. Balk's dusty face and inflamed eyes spoke of the hard day and sleepless night he had endured. For this battle he had received a Knight's Cross. The enemy, a good Normandy infantry division and a Spaga brigade, fought very bravely. His machine guns kept the whole street of the village under fire. It is true that the enemy had not been firing artillery for some time. Balk shared my opinion that the enemy resistance is paralyzed. In the morning, we got into our hands a captured French order, if I am not mistaken, signed by General Gamelin himself. The order said, "It is time to finally stop the flow of German tanks." This order further strengthened my conviction that it is necessary to continue the offensive by all means, because obviously the combat effectiveness of the French seriously worried their high command, now only to move without delay, without stopping. I ordered the men to line up and read them the trophy order, explaining its meaning and emphasizing the importance of the immediate continuation of the offensive. Then I thanked the soldiers and officers for the combat successes and demanded to gather all the forces to finally consolidate the victory. After all this, I gave the order to disperse it to the tanks and continue the offensive. The veil that kept us in the dark soon fell. We came to the operational space and at a rapid pace began the pursuit. In Poix-Terron, I met the Chief of Staff of the 2nd Panzer Division, Lieutenant Colonel von Quast, informed him of the situation and went to Novion-Porcienne and from there to Montcornet. On the way, I overtook the marching column of the 1st Armoured Division. The soldiers cheered up. Now they realized that this breakthrough, a complete victory. They greeted me with joyful shouts, "Well done, wonderful guy," "Our old man," "Saw the fast-moving Heinz," etc. In the market square of Montcornet, I met General Kempf, commander of the 6th Panzer Division of the Rheinguard Corps, whose troops, having crossed the Meuse, came to the city at the same time as my units. We had to distribute the territory of the city between 3 armoured divisions, the 1st, 2nd and 1st, which in their irresistible onslaught to the west flooded its streets. We had no orders from the group as to the dividing line between the corps, so we immediately on the spot united all divisions and began to continue the offensive to the last drop of gasoline. My advanced units reached Marle and Dursey. Meanwhile, I ordered the officers accompanying me to search the houses in the marketplace, and in a short time several hundred French prisoners from various units were collected. It was evident from their eyes how surprised they were at our sudden appearance. A tank company of the enemy, which had tried to break into the town from the southwest, was taken prisoner. It was part of General de Gaulle's division, which we knew was in the area north of Laon. In the small village of Soise, east of Montcornet, a corps command post was deployed and communications were established with the 1st and 2nd Armoured Divisions. We reported the progress of the day's fighting and our intentions to resume pursuit of the enemy on May 17th by radio to the Tank Group headquarters, see diagram 3b. After the brilliant success of May 16th and the successful battles of the 41st Army Corps, I could not think that my superiors still think to fix on the bridge fortification at the Maas and wait for the arrival of the infantry corps. I was completely possessed by the idea that I expressed in March at a report to Hitler, namely, to complete the breakthrough and do not stop until the shore of the English Channel. I could not imagine that Hitler himself, who approved of Manstein's bold plan of attack and did not protest against my plan to make the breakthrough, could be afraid of his own courage and stop the offensive. However, I was monstrously mistaken. This became clear to me the next morning. On the morning of May 17th, I was informed from the headquarters of the tank group that the offensive must be stopped, and I must report at 7 o'clock to the landing site for a personal conversation with General von Kleist. The latter appeared exactly at the appointed time and, without responding to my greeting, began to sharply reproach me for ignoring the plans of the High Command. He did not utter a word about the progress of my troops. When the first storm passed and there was a lull, I asked to be removed from command. General von Kleist was surprised, then nodded his head and ordered me to transfer command of the corps to the senior commander after me. That was the end of our conversation. I went to the command post, called General Feil, and handed him the command of the corps. I then reported by radio to the headquarters of Army Group Rundstedt that after the transfer of command I would arrive in the middle of the day to report. Very soon from there I received instructions to remain at my command post and await the arrival of Colonel General List, commander of the 12th Army, which was advancing behind my corps, who was charged with settling this conflict. Until the arrival of Colonel General List, orders were given to suspend the advance of all units. Major Wenck, who had returned to us, was fired upon en route by French tanks and wounded in the leg. General Feil arrived at the command post and was brought up to speed. In the afternoon, Colonel General List arrived and asked what, in fact, we had going on. I explained it to him. He cancelled in the name of Colonel General von Rundstedt the order to remove me from my post and said that the order to stop the offensive was given by the General Command of the Land Forces and therefore must be implemented. He agreed with my arguments regarding the continuation of the offensive and therefore authorized me on behalf of the Army Group Command to continue the advance of combat-ready reconnaissance units, but the Corps Command post should remain in the same place. This was already a step forward. I was very grateful to Colonel General List for his intervention and asked him to settle my conflict with General Kleist. And so I proceeded to advance combat-ready reconnaissance units. The Corps Command post was still at its old location at Suaz. I ordered a field cable to be laid between Corps headquarters and my forward command post, which obviated the need for radio communications that might have been intercepted by the radio intelligence of the Army High Command or the Armed Forces High Command. Even before receiving orders to halt the offensive, the 1st Armoured Division had occupied Ribemont on the Oise River and Crécy on the Serre River on the morning of May 17th. Advance units of the 10th Panzer Division, withdrawn from the area south of Sedan, reached Fricourt and Soles-Monclin. Already in the evening of May 17th managed to create a pre-bridge fortification on the river Oise near Moya. May 18th at 9 o'clock, 2nd Panzer Division came to St. Quentin. Acting to the left of the 1st Panzer Division also on this day forced the Oise and moved in the direction of Péronne. The 10th Armoured Division was following the advance divisions on the left, also on Péronne. On the morning of May 19th, the 1st Armoured Division succeeded in creating a pre-bridge fortification on the Somme River near the city. Several French headquarters that had arrived at Péronne for reconnaissance were captured directly by us. The forward command post of the Corps moved to Villesec. On May 19th, we passed the battlefields of World War I on the Somme. During the offensive north of the Enser and Somme rivers, securing the exposed left flank was initially entrusted to flank cover, consisting of scout, tank fighter and sapper units. There was little threat from the flank. As early as 16th May, we knew of the presence of a French armoured division, General de Gaulle's new formation, which, as already mentioned, had first engaged at Montcornet. De Gaulle confirmed our information a few days later. On May 18th, several tanks from his division came within 2 kilometres of my forward command post in the Olnona forest, guarded only by a few 20mm anti-aircraft guns. I survived a couple of hours in lingering obscurity until these formidable guests turned back. There was also knowledge of a French reserve army of about 8 infantry divisions forming up in the Paris area. We did not suppose that General Frère would move against us while we ourselves were still in motion. According to French principles of combat, he had to wait for accurate information about the location of the enemy. So it was a question of keeping him in the dark. This was best accomplished by a continuous offensive. On the evening of May 19th, the 19th Army Corps reached the line Cambrai-Péronne, Ham. According to my calculations, the 1st Armoured Division could be ready to advance on Amiens by 9 o'clock. I booked myself a car for 5 o'clock, as I wanted to witness this historic act. The officers on my staff thought that I wanted to leave too early and advised me to delay my departure, but I insisted and was right. When, on May 20th at 8 o'clock 45 minutes, I arrived on the northern outskirts of Amiens, the 1st Panzer Division was preparing to go on the offensive. On the way, I ascertained that the 10th Armoured Division was at Péronne and learned interesting details about how the 1st Armoured Division's shift was proceeding. Parts of the 1st Armoured Division, defending the bridge fortification, were withdrawn without waiting for the arrival of the shift, because Lieutenant Colonel Bulck, who commanded them, did not want to miss the moment of the offensive on Amiens, which he considered more important than the defence of the bridge fortification. Colonel Landgraf, who had replaced him, was extremely indignant at such frivolity, but Bulck replied to his reproaches, "Well then, seize this bridgehead again. I had to capture it." Fortunately, the enemy gave Landgraf time to retake the abandoned bridgehead without a fight. I bypassed from the South Albert, still in enemy hands, and headed for Amiens, meeting countless columns of refugees on the way. The 1st Armoured Division's offensive was progressing well, and by mid-afternoon the town and a bridgehead about 7 kilometres deep were in our hands. I took a quick look at the captured terrain and town, especially the beautiful cathedral, and quickly headed down the road to Alba, where I expected to find the 2nd Armoured Division. I rode toward the stream of advancing troops and refugees. Many enemy vehicles were wedged into the German marching columns, the drivers of which hoped to remain undetected in the thick dust, reach Paris, and avoid capture. In a short time, I took 15 British prisoners. At Alba, I met General Feuillet. The 2nd Armoured Division captured an English battery on the training ground, which was armed only with training shells, for no one had expected our appearance. Prisoners of war of various nationalities filled the square and streets of the city. The fears of the 2nd Armoured Division that the offensive would have to be suspended for lack of fuel soon dissipated. The division was ordered to reach Abbeville today. By 7 p.m. it fulfilled it, passing through Dullen-Berneville, Beaumais, Saint-Riquier. It is true that our planes put this division at a disadvantage by bombarding it from time to time. After I visited the commander of the 2nd Armoured Brigade, Colonel von Prittwitz, who was characterized by great mobility, and made sure that he spoke at Abbeville, I went to Carrier, northeast of Amiens, where the Corps headquarters was moved. Here we were attacked by our own airplanes. It was such an unfriendly act that our anti-aircraft artillery returned fire and got one such inattentive bird. Both pilots parachuted out and were soon sitting in front of me, looking at each other with unpleasant surprise. When the first agonizing part of the conversation was over, I propped the young men up with a glass of champagne. Unfortunately, they crashed a new reconnaissance armoured vehicle that had just arrived. Still, that